You're listening to the Career Interrupted podcast. I'm your host, Joy Foster. Today I'm live with Susannah de Jager and Patsy Day, hosts of the Wobbly Middle podcast. Susannah had a high-flying career in hedge funds, and Patsy had a career she loved, until she didn't, in intellectual property law. Eventually, they found each other, and the rest is history. And I'm really grateful that they invited me on their podcast, and I wanted to reciprocate and invite them on my podcast, and they've got a great story to tell. So we're going to start with Susannah's story, and then we're going to go over to Patsy's story. Susannah, let's just dive straight in. You were in this career that you were, that was going to be what you were going to do, hedge funds, etc. That was it. And then it wasn't. So tell us about your career interruption.
So it was a bit of a shocker. It was like everything sort of came crashing down all at once, as I think often is the way. We lost our largest client at work. And so the whole thing was thrown in turmoil and really stressful. And at the same time, very sadly, my husband and I, one of our children's godparents, was dying of cancer. He was really close to us. He didn't have his own family and lived near to us physically. So we basically had 6 months where we were not caring for him, but very closely, grieving for him in advance, helping him have the most elegant death, I suppose, that was possible. And so I had this work stress going on. And then, you can't make it up, Joy. My nanny also quit at the same time. I had a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old. And then I would say that the turmoil at work caused a whole load of other ruptures. And it just became really apparent that my position there was not tenable anymore. And so I went from having everything really pretty grounded to realizing I can't stay. I can't really wait long enough to find something to go on to. It's okay. I've got 6 months gardening leave. I'm going to take this time, make a proactive choice, and I'm going to stop before I kind of run headlong into the burnout black wall. And so I did.
And then
that was
COVID happened.
COVID. And I was like, oh my God, what have I done?
So,
yeah.
I mean, that's got to be when the stakes are the highest, the stress for work and then it not being tenable anymore. You think, okay, I've got these 6 months to work it out, and your nanny's no longer there. You've got one of your best friends is dying of cancer. And, you're sitting there thinking, okay, I'm gonna give myself 6 months, and then COVID hits. So what was going through your mind? What were the fears and the doubts? What did it mean if you couldn't get things sorted and your next move going in the right direction?
It was huge. I think that the way I often think about, and this was pretty much like my second job out of university, like I had been there nearly a decade. So it was a huge chunk of time for me. And I had just it's like an extension of an academic career at that point. Like you haven't really looked up is how I would describe it. You're like on the conveyor belt, just doing your thing, thinking that, if you keep working hard and everyone will pat you on the head and it'll keep being okay. And I guess that for me, I just had this absolutely seismic realization that was not the case and that working hard hadn't made me safe. And for lots of reasons that I was subject to in that environment, that I didn't have a part of my identity that I had become very used to having, which was very secure. I was very good at what I did. I had been promoted quite a lot as a young person. Like I was 29 when I was made partner. I was 32. I was the CEO, in a small firm. I wouldn't want to exaggerate, but these were big things for me. And suddenly it was all stripped away and it was just me. And I was a mother, which I was hugely grateful for. But that identity felt so incomplete for me at that time and at that age, I think, as well. And it was so disconcerting. And what really doubled that down for me is that I then started having conversations with people. And I had, as I say, been there a decade. I'd been a COO for 6 years. I'd done complicated transactions. I really saved the ship a few times on important things to the firm. And I had people in the industry who maybe didn't know that firm very well. Also, it was a small firm. There's not that much brand currency in those small firms. It's not Goldman Sachs. And the reflection I got of my value to them in the workplace, and this was, quite friendly people in some cases who thought they were being helpful, but also recruiters. I remember one in particular, female, saying, well, you were basically just an office manager. Now, no disrespect to the job of being an office manager, but it didn't reflect what I had been doing. So I had the reality of my situation, and that my kind of career had come pretty abruptly to an end in ways that I hadn't really chosen or been able to design. And then I had this realization that I had not been very good at the way that I promoted myself externally during that time, because I hadn't thought I needed to, and that the perception of my value in the workplace didn't reconcile with what I hoped, and really hoped my colleagues up till that date would have said it actually had been. So that was pretty shocking.
Yeah. So I can imagine that it's an identity crisis almost more than anything, where people are saying back to you what they think you do, and you're saying, well, that's definitely not a reflection of what I do. So, it's the fears and doubts set in, like, is anyone going to take me seriously, or is anyone going to understand what I actually did? And, and we're talking about as well an industry where there's not a lot of women anyway. And then if people can't see the value in what you're doing, that then can have a big knock-on effect personally. So what was the biggest thing, I guess, if you could articulate the fear and the doubt that came in, because I'm curious, going through that sounds pretty painful, sounds pretty hard, but, here you are, COVID, no one's really hiring because everyone wants to wait until people are back in the office again. We don't know how long COVID's going to go on. What was the core thought that you were having at that point of time?
It was quite mixed up, if I were to be really candid about it. I would have moments of really seeing it as you just described, right? Like, these are forces I'm subject to. The whole world is, in a similar boat in varying degrees. You've got to count your blessings, be grateful for the things you do have. But then this niggling fear sits there. And, part of that's going to be personality specific. But I think it's quite a valid feeling, particularly when your ability to move out of it is so curtailed. So it wasn't just what had happened and the realization, it was then the forces of COVID and the interruption that made on all industries that sort of compounded these things. And I just had to try and quieten these feelings. And I think on the positive side, it actually gave me time to sort of grieve for that identity, because I think that when you decouple from something that perhaps you didn't even choose, but it sort of came to you, you didn't even acknowledge it, you didn't even necessarily welcome it, but you suddenly realize that you're wearing this cloak. And then when you have to take it off, you really strip back to, well, what am I? What are my values? What is important to me? And I think if I hadn't had that time, as unwelcome as it was at the time, I wouldn't be in such a grounded place as I am now. So I think that with the benefit of hindsight, I see it as almost a privilege when you get to have these moments of quiet where you can reflect on what you actually want to choose going forward. Some people never get that opportunity, and they just go through their lives with their heads down, with their blinkers on, whatever you want to call it, not having really considered what they want to be, who they want to be, what they want their work to represent. And so I would say, for anyone listening, it was really hard. And I'm really pleased I went through it, but that doesn't mean it felt great at the time.
No, that's a great point. So what was the surprise that came out of it for you?
I think probably that, actually on the other side, that I would feel more enlightened about myself and be much, I've got proper boundaries now that I didn't have before. I've made choices about the type of people I will work with, the type of people I won't work with. Patsy obviously being a wonderful example. And I really feel that I understand myself better, as it would have hopefully happened as I grew older anyway. But that period where you have to reconcile and really look in the mirror and take your own self-worth from what you know about yourself, rather than from external validation or any other kind of form of identity or validation that you might seek. It's pretty important to go through that as an adult, and probably as a parent as well. And I think that was the surprise, because at the time it felt grim, and now I wouldn't wish it away for the world.
I love that. So tell us what you are doing now. Of course, I've got Patsy waiting in the wings to come and tell her story. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
So like you, we think that this is a really important phase for women, and that it is worth talking about, because it can feel really lonely when you go through it. So Patsy and I, started the Wobbly Middle podcast together really similar to you. And honestly, I couldn't be more thrilled. The more conversations there are out there like this, helping women understand this is quite a shared experience, even if it feels quite lonely at the time, and to look at people further ahead and say, oh, there's a way through. So in answer to your question more fully, I'm doing the Wobbly Middle. I have another podcast focused on the innovation that comes out of amazing places like Oxford, the university, and more broadly, that I interview founders and investors, which kind of dovetails back with my experience in the investing world before. And I've got advisory work. I've also just moved to Abu Dhabi, so I've got like more plans afoot. But I would say that the kind of identity work that I did has set the bedrock for me being able to identify things I love, the kind of work I'm happy doing, and as I said, the people that I want to do it with. And that really is such a strong place to be building from. And I am still building, but I feel really happy about where I am.
I love that. And is there, if you could think of a motto that you live by, is there, or a saying that really has impacted you, could you share that with us?
Well, no, I just want to copy the one that you gave us last week, Joy, because when you said like I bloom on any mountain or in any environment, I really feel like I share that sentiment. And as much as you said it, and I was like, God, that's uncanny. I really have thought of that over the years in relation to myself. Like I just back myself to make a good opportunity out of the circumstances that I am dealt. And I think that self-confidence is a really beautiful thing to try and foster in oneself. And so, yeah, just kind of back yourself, I think would be it.
Yeah, back yourself, bloom where you're planted, make lemonade out of lemons, right? Okay, thank you so much, Susannah. All right, so I want to bring on Patsy now, who is Susannah's partner in the podcast world with the Wobbly Middle. So Patsy, thank you for coming on as well. And let's just dive into your career interruption, because it was interesting when we were sort of doing the pre-chat, how the time of your life when your career interruption happened and the career you had, which was in intellectual property, was slightly different from the timing that Susannah had. But both careers, your career in intellectual property law, they were big careers. So you had a long time in intellectual property. You actually loved intellectual property. It wasn't like you were doing a career you didn't enjoy. So talk about what happened for you, how your career was interrupted.
Yes, so I am a good 10 years older than Susannah, so almost a decade older than her, but we have children the same age. And so this period that we're in, you can see it can kind of stretch over, these pressures that come into our life can kind of happen at any stage. But I loved the law. I loved the problem solving. I loved the variation. I loved that I started working on anti-counterfeiting, which was quite exciting. We'd sort of be investigating the sources of fake products, everything from fake pharmaceuticals to, fake mobile phones. And then I did some commercial stuff, and I ended in publishing as a publishing lawyer at Oxford University Press, which I loved because essentially I just like to read all day, actually would be my favorite thing ever. But it was super fulfilling until the moment it wasn't. And we are lucky to have loved jobs because we know we can love them. And then we know what it is to not love them. But it's hard when you stop loving something that's always meant so much to you.
Yeah, and you mentioned to me that you probably would identify it now in retrospect as burnout, but then at the time it was hard to tell the signs. And I've heard that from a lot of people that I've interviewed where they felt like the career interruption was burnout and the signs weren't obvious. When you think about the word burnout, when you think about that point where you just stopped loving what you were doing, what did that mean for you in terms of, the stakes? Because at that point, did you have to make the decision that you were going to walk away, and how was that going to impact you?
Yeah, well, I think for me, the major symptoms of the burnout are really bone crunching, deep, deep fatigue. And I'd been going to the doctors the whole time, just saying, I'm so tired. Can you check my bloods? I'm so tired. What is this? What is this? I wasn't sleeping very well. And so, even though I was so exhausted, I then couldn't sleep. So it was very much the physical manifestation of everything that was going on was this very kind of, I don't know, it feels like bone crunching. It felt like everything became a grind.
Mm.
And it was a slow burn. Susannah spoke about high impact things. For me, it wasn't high impact. I had a very supportive boss at work. I had a flexibility in that I was working 4 days a week, but I had a very poorly elderly uncle who had no children. So I had caring responsibilities. I had fairly young children. COVID came, there was the working from home. And then I suppose there's perimenopause. But in the end, there was just a moment where I crashed my husband's car. And no one was injured, but it was very shocking, as these things are. And I had to go home, and I just knew that something needed to change. I knew that that was a real moment. And I knew that with crashing the car also meant endless phone calls to insurers, sorting everything out, having a discussion with my husband, who doesn't really care about those things, but he also doesn't mind that I've dented every single one of the wheel trims on my car and my bumper looks shabby. He doesn't care about things like that. But still, to just go back, it felt like my fault, even though it wasn't. And then from that moment on, I just knew I had to stop working with no plan.
Well, I can imagine stopping working with no plan would be quite scary. What were the fears and doubts that you had in that moment? Because that's quite a big decision to take, but I can see why you took it.
The legal profession is very structured. It is structured in its training. It's structured in when if you're working in private practice, it's structured by your time keeping. And I just knew that I thought I'd take some time off and then maybe find another job in law, but I was actually too tired. And then so I realized that if I wasn't going back into law, I didn't know what else there was. I had no idea what else I would do. And I'd ask all my friends, if you weren't doing what you were doing now, what would you be doing? And there were so many of us in the same boat. And no one really had answers about, even if you didn't know what you wanted to do, nobody could tell me how to work out what I wanted to do. And the first 6 months after work, I just read a lot. I watched a lot of pretty dodgy television. I probably watched every Amazon Christmas movie shamelessly. I didn't try and improve myself. I didn't learn any languages. I didn't get fit. I did nothing. And slowly I felt myself coming back to myself. And slowly I felt, we spoke earlier about if you've been working in an area like the law, for example, there's very little space in your life for something creative. And so some parts of you are very repressed, and things like choosing new curtains. Well, I don't know what I like. I don't know, there's all these curtains out there. How do I know what's good taste and what's bad? And I just slowly started coming back to myself. And at about that time, I'd helped a friend on a podcast, so that I'd helped with some legal work. And she had said to me in the January, would you like to get more involved? And I'd said, no, I've just stopped work. I can't do anything. And then by the September time, she revisited that with me, and I felt a little bit more ready to throw myself in something new.
That's so interesting. So what was the biggest surprise that came out of your career interruption?
That there is more fulfilling work out there for us. And this podcast that I was telling you about, it's about Safe House in Amsterdam that took in Jewish kids during the war. And then the Safe House had this long history after the war for the next sort of 60, 80 years. And it always traded on this wartime experience. But what went on in the house, it became a bit culty and weird. And this podcast that I've been drawn into sort of as a producer and an editor, it's opened up this whole new world for me. I go to places in history that I wouldn't have known about. I've gone to cities. I've understood the journalist that I'm working with he's really tremendous, and he's so generous in sharing with how he thinks about things, how he tackles. I'm just learning every day I work on this with him. And it's exciting, that there's so much out there in the world that we can be curious about. And it's been very joyful, fulfilling experience. And even because we've even where you pitch something and it doesn't go so well, you still learn from all of that. I think the real thing is that a lot of us have stepped away from our work in the sort of maybe our 30s, where possibly our ambition collided with the realities of having children. And we've stepped away from work, we've lent into the family, which is, what felt right to some of us at the time. But that as our children get older, as we work through some stuff, there is so much out there that is so exciting. We just need to find it.
I love that. And I can feel the enthusiasm, which is so beautiful. So given all of your experiences, I mean, is there a motto that you live by?
I can't put it into anything very succinct, but what I've learned from doing the Wobbly Middle podcast and what I've heard from everyone we've interviewed is that you need to get started. And getting started looks different, but it also takes a long time. Getting started takes a long time. And so you think, oh, I'm not ready to start yet, or I'll start in a bit. But getting started is having that kernel, exploring it, or if you don't have any kernel of idea what you want to do, just get out a page and start writing down mad things. I want to be a brain surgeon. I want to do interior designing, both mad things for me. And just start working on something. And then it's about iteration. We often see the final product and think I could never do that, but it's been a very iterative learning process up until that point. And with the Wobbly Middle podcast, I could have planned and put off forever, but Susannah said, no, we're doing it now. Can we just stop talking about it and just do it? And I was like, okay. And we've learned so much from the just doing. Oh, there you are, Susannah, you're back. So yes, so I would say get started, and that starting takes a long time, and that starting isn't the finished product. If you can make that more succinct, come up with a little motto for me to live by, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I think get started is the motto, right? So just get started, just do it. And, with Susannah's back yourself, I think those two go really well together. I was at the Mel Robbins tour last night live. And one of the things that she threw out there, which I thought was fascinating, was, if you're really stuck, go to ChatGPT and say, I want to get started on this thing, whatever it is, in the next 30 days, give me a 15-minute-a-day plan. And I just thought that was genius. So, anyone listening, I would encourage you to go try it. I'm definitely going to go try it today. But I just want to say thank you to Patsy and Susannah for being here today. They have interviewed me on their podcast. We will put their podcast in the show notes that they did with me. But also, I want to make sure that we link to the podcast and the projects that you're working on. And I just want to take a moment to talk about the fact that, starting a podcast is a legitimate thing, and that you guys are doing this together and that you're loving it together and you're learning so much from it. So before we let you go, just where can people find about the Wobbly Middle? Susannah, I'll let you do that. And then Patsy, if someone wanted to get started in podcasting, what would be the first recommendation that you would make? So Susannah, go for it. Where can people find you?
You can find it on all your podcast platforms. So Spotify, Apple, wherever you get them. But it's on everything.
And it's called the Wobbly Middle. And Patsy, what would be your recommendation, since you're the just get started queen? What would be your recommendation for someone if they wanted to just get started with podcasting?
Well, you can get started with your mobile phone. So don't get sucked into expensive microphones, expensive headsets. Start with the basics, put it out there, and then just listen to what it sounds like, and then do it some more. So there's a low barrier to entry. And if you just start, then you can work on it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you coming today.
Thank you, Joy.
All right. Well, my top tips for getting started on podcasting are very similar to Patsy's. When I started my podcast, I had no idea, who was going to listen to it or what I was going to talk about. And it's changed over the years, what I talk about, who I talk to. And we've been doing the Career Interrupted podcast for a while now, which I absolutely love. But we've had over 130,000 downloads of our podcast since we started. And if you go to techpixies.com/podcast, we have a free guide to get started in podcasting. And I tell you exactly what I did step by step. It was really simple. I did Facebook Lives, downloaded those videos, uploaded them to Buzzsprout. I didn't do any editing the very first podcasts are completely, unedited. It was all me. I had no team helping me to do it. And over time, I eventually hired a team that now does the editing and the copywriting and the show notes and all that good stuff. But I can tell you that it is a great starting point. And, having just gone to the Mel Robbins tour and seen her live, that is exactly what she got started with. She got started with a self-published book. The 5-Second Rule was her very first self-published book. And then she went on to, start to write a second book, which was the High Five Yourself book. And then she started her podcast, and then her podcast took off massively. She's like the number one podcast across all of the networks. So, podcasting is a legit thing that you can do these days if it's something that you're interested in. And go check out our free guide to get started. Take Patsy's advice. Use your phone. I use social media, and it's a great, great way to get yourself out there, especially if it's something you're really interested in, because there are podcasts on absolutely everything from, connecting with your dog to, the best wines in the world to, mysterious things that happen, right? So it's a wonderful thing for you to explore and get to meet and interview interesting people, just like I get to do. So anyway, if you're interested, if you're loving this podcast, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. I love a review. I do read the reviews, and it helps me keep on track. It makes me feel good that we are delivering something that you love. And I want to say thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next week, same time and same place, wherever you listen to us. Bye for now.